there have certainly been times as a pastor that I've thought, gee, it sure would have been nice to be a pastor in the 60s, when everyone was going to church and being a pastor meant something. You had some influence, right? People respected your opinion, they asked you to sit on boards and this and that, or councils or whatever, and that's just not the case anymore. Now, you say you're a pastor and people might feel suspicious.
Right. Right.
I hesitate to say that I'm a pastor. I was at a friend's birthday party. Or it was my son's friend's birthday party, and it was a family from church. And then I met one of their friends, and we were chit-chatting, and he shared with me his whole life story, and it was great. But and then he's finally, after like 20 minutes, he's like, "So what do you do?" I'm like, "Oh shoot, what do I say? What do I say?"
Right.
And I did say, "Well, I happen to be their pastor," and and he's like, "Oh," and then that was like 2 more minutes of conversation, and that was about it. and it's hard, right? Because we want to be faithful to our calling as well as pastors, but even just as human beings and children of God, and it's anyway, the world has changed. And so, well, and maybe you can even speak to your own experience. How do we, what might Hebrews say, or just your own reflections? How do we kind of be the leaders that we need to be for the world as it is today?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's really good. And I feel like that takes us to this latter part, which I hope that for listeners, and of course, probably your listeners are very familiar with Hebrews, but when I was studying this and knew I had to write up on this, verse 17 really kind of grabbed me, because it says, I liked your translation. Did it say trust your leaders or have confidence?
Have confidence in your leaders. Yeah, this is the NIV.
That's a good translation. And then it goes on to say, and submit to them or obey them, defer to them. Ooh, already I'm kind of like, oh my goodness, red flags. Like, what do we do with it? The earliest commentary on Hebrews is by John Chrysostom, the famous preacher, the golden mouth preacher. And on this verse, he says, it's better to have no leaders at all than a bad leader. So I was very comforted that the first interpreter recognized, hey, humans could misuse this instruction.
Yeah.
But let me tie that together with what we were just talking about. We live in a context, as did Hebrews, and maybe this is an advantage that we have over pastors in certain places in the 60s. They had it maybe easy in some ways. We struggle in the way that some early Christians struggled. Now, we're not dying for our faith. I'm not, at least, right? But there's a shame associated that would have been true for them. And so there's a vibrancy to these messages that connect with us in a deep way. If we keep in mind that there is a cost, a shame with being a pastor, I think that humility will help us not misuse the leadership power that we have in our congregations. Because when we remember that we need to lead in such a way that our people will willingly want to go along with our leadership, we have to do that not in this kind of power-hungry, dictatorial way, but of course, the way that Jesus led. And then actually, as we go outside of our congregations and have to admit, yep, actually, I'm a pastor, that might open up a window to say, hey, I've heard bad things about pastors, the person might say. You can say, yeah, I identify those are bad. Let me talk about the way in which Jesus instructed us to lead, which is through humility and service and listening, and not through using one's power to serve your own selfish needs. I think there's a connection there. It keeps us honest. It keeps us faithful when we know that we're going to have to provide an answer for the calling that we have.
Yeah, that's good. One of the things that I've found is true is that, so when we're, a lot of churches are having to lead through change, so to speak, right now, right? Because the world is changing and and not just from COVID, but just over the last, 50, 60, 70 years, the world is, some might say we live in a post-Christendom kind of world, just where Christianity doesn't have the same, as we're kind of already saying, impact and influence and centrality that it once had. And so when we say, okay, well, maybe we need to do this, or maybe we need to be in our neighborhood in this new way, whatever that might be, or maybe we need to make some changes to the way we're structured, or do our worship services, or do our Christian education or outreach, or whatever it might be. And that might mean letting go of some things that we used to do, right? That people have loved in the past, right? And so there's an experience of loss for people in our congregations, and even for, I think, pastors themselves in some ways. And then there's resistance, right? There's loss, and then there's resistance, which requires a healthy response from the pastor, from the leader, resilience, perhaps, right?
Yes.
And so I don't know if you have any thoughts in terms of what the book of Hebrews might say, and this passage in particular, or anywhere, in terms of helping us help our people navigate loss, and then responding in a healthy way to the resistance that we might experience. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Very vital, important.
And feel free to speak to your own experience as well, as a pastor, as a priest.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I think that first question of loss is at the forefront, actually, of this passage, because the initial instruction is remember your leaders and pay attention to the end, the outcome of their life. That means that they've had leaders who have passed away. That's how everyone sees it. So this community and these leaders spoke the word of God to them. I mean, think about a beloved mentor in your life, or a former pastor, or teacher that made a real impact. You love that person, and you become, your faith is tied to theirs in many ways. When they leave, that is a great loss. So it is beautiful to me that the very next verse, and this is a verse that's pretty well known from Hebrews. I think there are several greatest hits out of Hebrews. We know the verse, but maybe not the context. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now, that's an important, Christological verse. But notice where it comes. I think the author is saying, hey, you might be grieving those leaders who have passed away, but let me offer you the comfort that Jesus, our number one and chief leader, is never going to leave you. And so maybe that's an answer, not for just the loss of a person, but for congregational loss. Things are changing and we're grieving, but let's keep our vision on the stability of Jesus Christ. And that helps us navigate those things that we have to give up.
Yeah, that's great. It's so good to have that, right, as a foundation. Our sanctuary, actually, big, right above the, we call it a stage because we're kind of a contemporary church. What do we call it? Anyway, above where the pulpit is and where the table is, Jesus Christ, same yesterday, today, and forever. And so it's beautiful, and I love having that there. That's how they designed that sanctuary back, 50 years ago. And then, so that's really helpful in terms of navigating loss, right?
Yeah, but then you also ask about resistance.
That's right.
And I think Hebrews offers some insights there as well. For that, I probably would take us back to Hebrews 3 and 4. So just encourage your listeners, they might want to go back and read that. The author spends a significant amount of time thinking about the wilderness generation. So these are the people of Israel who God redeemed miraculously out of Egypt. And then did lots of miracles, gave them the law. But then when it was time to go into the land, they didn't trust that God was sufficient to bring them into the land. The author of Hebrews lifts up this example to say to this community, you're in a wilderness too, right? You've seen God's deliverance. You've trusted in Christ for your salvation, but you've not reached your goal yet.